Hello.
Hi, Timothy. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Great.
Been a while. It's good to see you.
I know. Good to see you. Oliver, good to see you.
Good to
Look
see
at
you.
Oliver with a big beard. Oh my
I
God.
know. I know. That's that goes with old age, you know.
I just got mine cut the other day.
Really. Gloria,
Hello.
there, well,
Gloria, look at
Hello.
you.
take care.
I'm fine, and you?
It's all right. Manuel, nice to see you again. You're on another panel on military history. Good. Okay, so I think we have everybody on the panel. Fisayo Ajala,
Yeah, yes.
Bush. Yeah, nice to see you. Welcome. Uh, Gloria Chuku is here. Oliver Coates is here. Inform Epotun has not joined yet. And Manuel Modi is here. Looks like he's out, again. So I want to welcome you to this panel. The folks here have been very strict with time, so we got to get it running, and hoping that the other folks will be able to join us as we progress. This is a panel on author meets readers, and this panel is going to be exploring Stapleton's really very interesting and engaging book, West African Soldiers in British Colonial Army, 1860 to 1960, which in many ways explores the history of British West African Colonial Army, and doing that within the broader social context of the society, West Africa in terms of identity and many other issues. So this is a very interesting book. So we're gonna begin with the discussants giving an overview of the book for 10 minutes, and then we will leave about 15 minutes for Tim to respond to those questions. I mean, to any questions and the comments from the discussants, and then we will leave it open to any questions that may come from readers and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go by the order we have on the program, beginning with Fisayo Ajala, Stellenbosch University.
Okay. Yeah, I am Tim. Good evening from me.
Hello.
Stellenbosch. I think we must have interacted some time ago. Maybe you don't remember. Yeah, but yes, but I sent you an email, I think sometime last year.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, and greetings to all the very senior professors. Some have read their works, and I know I've met Oliver at ASA, and I'm also familiar with the works of Professor Gloria Chuku and Professor Chima Korea. Yeah, so the book was a very interesting one for me, especially because my dissertation, which I completed last year, was also focused on the military, and this time military widows in Nigeria. So my dissertation was on military widows of Nigeria's Boko Haram conflict, where I sought to understand how these women have coped and survived after their husband's death. Yeah, so a particular challenge for me during my thesis was the paucity of literature on Nigerian military widows generally. Yeah, so seeing Professor Stapleton's book, particularly the chapter on women, intrigued me very much because I think he did justice to that chapter in trying to understand the development or how women were integrated into the colonial army, the flux in which they took. They were integrated, they had to move out at some point, and they also came back again. He also gave an historical background into the domestic roles they actually played. Took it from from how they were seen as camp followers, in the European armies, and how that also persisted even in African colonial militaries as well. And also, I also like the part in which he also laid. I think he also answered the question of mami markets in Nigeria. So yeah, so everyone, even up to it was when I read this book that I really saw that okay, so the woman who is credited to be the founder of Mami Market was actually not the person. That was quite surprising to me, and I'm sure if it goes out, I'm sure a lot of people will not take kindly to that information because we already know that okay, it is Miriam Ochefu, Ochefu, Mrs. Ochefu. Everybody assumed that that is the founder of Mami Market. Even as she mentioned other people who had purchased, who patronized her while she ran the market. But it was just good to have that bit of background information on how the market came to be. And I think another thing I also found very interesting in the book is how history is cyclical. Nothing is really new. So whatever challenges, for instance, in my study, I realized that widows, regardless of wherever they are, encounter almost similar problems. So you find issues of widows dealing with in-laws, over issues like benefit and pensions. So you find issues of a woman married to a soldier, and maybe it's until perhaps the soldier must have been, she may not know that she's not the legitimate wife, so because of their frequent travels, or in other instances where the in-laws partly with soldiers to ensure that a particular woman does not get a benefit or get lost a part. So I saw some of those in also Stapleton's book. And also I also read a book by Sarah Zimmerman on militarizing the military in French West Africa. And she also made mention to also issues like that. So putting all of this together really does make me see that all of these issues that are present in post-colonial militaries, particularly the social aspect, I also actually have an historical trend, which is important for us not to miss if we are to understand it as holistically. So some of these things are also not, they are not new. They've always been with us. And it does also shows that how over time, we really don't pay attention to history, and how military authorities have also failed to address these problems that reoccur from time to time. And I think another aspect of the book which also intrigued me was the question of martial race. So we have been treated to the fact that okay, there's actually some races that are martial than the other. But as Prof showed us in his book, that the question of the martial race was just at the pleasure of the British military administrators. They determined which race was martial or not. So you could be martial at one point, or you could be fit for military service at one point, and maybe because you're interested in other things like trade, like working in the civil service or working for the colonial service, they would think, oh, you are not also fit for military service. So it was depending on the relations of these local communities, the willingness of their chiefs to also provide soldiers that will volunteer. Those were the things that determined whether a race was strong and fit for military service. And I also remember the case of the Kenyans. I'm trying to remember the nomadics who appear to be tall and who are that height for military service, but rather prefer to be pastoralists as compared to the other groups who also took military service more seriously than the others. So those were the ways in which the book, those are the aspects in which I really enjoyed reading the book as a whole. And also the question of, I'll also go back to another question which also intrigued me, the question of catering to soldiers, demobilization, and the rest of that. So some of those questions, again, too, considering that Nigeria is also still fighting the Boko Haram conflict, these are some of those questions that will also still be revisited whenever the conflict comes to an end, because these issues are issues that have been present before, and it's as if we are just going around in circles. But I think overall, like, it was a book I really enjoyed reading. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. We're going to leave any comments after the discussants have provided their overview. So we will, I think, Dr. Modi has joined again. I think his connection is not very good. So we will move straight to the next discussant, Professor Gloria Chukwu.
Oh, thank you. Greetings to all the panelists and people in the audience. The West African soldiers in Britain's colonial army is a dense book, well written. 11 chapters for those of you who have not read the book or have not seen a copy, especially with the cost of the book, which made it difficult for some of us to have the actual hard copies. It is also arranged in thematical order and covers, I think, 4 British colonies of and the Gambia. What I section or the intersectionality of gender, religion, ethnicity, nationality, religion, and regional compositions, each having an impact on the history that is recorded in the book. Now, the book also starts with the origin of the British army in West Africa. We started with ex-slaves and those running away from being enslaved, to enlistment and conscription and so forth, until the formation of the West African Frontier Force and regional branches or barracks. But I want to emphasize some areas that attracted my attention as I was reading the book. One is the Hausa factor, the role the Hausa factor played, how soldiers, including those from the hinterland of Nigeria, became known as or identified as Hausa soldiers. The author does his best to explain how this phenomenon emerged and came to dominate the West African soldiers in Britain's colonial army. Now, one area I have a question, because as I discuss or highlight important areas I want to ask questions so that I don't go back asking those questions that might result to repetition. In the 1930s, as the author records, Northern Muslim elites associated the army with immoral practices. And this resulted in the decline of number of Hausa soldiers in Britain's colonial army. And the decline led to enlistment of Kanuri and Fulani men. This raises some question to me. Why the decline based on immorality identified in drinking alcohol and sexual promiscuity, as if Kanuri men and Fulani men were not Muslims. They were Muslims. They were also bound by the ethics and ideology of the religion. So that's an area that I would like the author to expatiate more, because he left me thinking with all sorts of ideas. Of course, extensive attention is given to the enlistment of TV and middle belt men into the military, and the reasons why a good number of them enlisted in the 1920s, the impact of the railway, construction, taxation, and the emphasis on cash crop. That is well understood. But of course, when it comes to labeling of soldiers based on ethnic identities, the Yoruba once being labeled as macho ethnic group in the army, then they lost that rank when some of them began to enlist in the logistical aspect of the military. Then the Hausa once earned that title. And of course, as they declined, other ethnic groups took up the title of macho. But again, I am intrigued by the fact that the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria, based on a mistake of one colonial officer, assumed a negative image as non-macho and perhaps lazy soldiers. This is an area that most sources would have out, other than colonial materials, to expatiate more and fill in missing gaps in the narrative. But where I want to pay more attention is the military women. It is a very fascinating chapter, ranging from the stabilizing influence of the military women, how they started, and the various roles they played, mainly preparing food and cleaning and maintenance of military cantonments and so forth. And of course, the origin or the emergence of the Magejia, the head women who helped to instill discipline among military life in the barracks, played other functions to check military wives and daughters. My question is, although to the sense of spare women, but I'm not sure what's in the Gambia. But my question is, what about the Calabar area, for instance, where we have predominantly Yoruba soldiers? Do they have Magejia or some other title given to women? And incidentally, as the book indicates, Magejia, or these head women, were the women that earned some kind of salary or income from the military because of the key roles they play. There's also the issue of desertion when soldiers were deployed overseas, especially during the Second World War years. The difficulties, the challenges military wives encountered, the fact that they no longer lived in the barracks and therefore didn't enjoy certain benefits that military wives who lived in barracks enjoyed prior to World War II and post-World War II periods. I am impressed by such detailed accounts and examples were given. And of course, the emergence of or the use of petitions and communications. One question I have in this regard is the nature of communication channels between military wives who were in Nigeria, for instance, and their husbands who were stationed overseas, or other than letter writing. Were there other forms of communications that they deployed? Then the issue of British women in the West African Army, quite interesting. Reference was made to Polish officers during the Second World War being less inhibitive in terms of having relationships with West African women. I wonder why it was the case. It was left hanging without any explanation as to what it has to do with the culture and why they were singled out as European officers who didn't bother having sexual relations with West African women. And of course, the generational divide between young wives, young European officers' wives. I don't know whether, I didn't see anywhere where such discussion is made of West African wives, whether there are generational divides and differences and the nature of those generational differences would have been very, very helpful in understanding the nuances of interactions and the dynamism that occurred among military women, whether in the barracks or outside. I don't know, I think I may have to end here, but I want to emphasize the fact that this is a very impressive work. and has potential and opportunities and directions for future research. There is no doubt is not hidden the heavy reliance on archival sources, which has its challenges too. One can only imagine the outcome of a work or this work if other primary sources are available, such as interviews, memoirs, photographs. But I hope future researchers would use this book as a reference point to further explore some areas highlighted in the book, but have gaps that such other sources are likely going to help to fill. But I truly, truly commend Professor Stapleton for this important work. Congratulations. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to read it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna go to Dr. Coates, University of Cambridge.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Stapleton for writing this fascinating book, and also to Sahid for creating and inviting me to participate in this panel. So I think, so before I start, I should say probably that I've reviewed this book in Canadian Journal of African Studies, so I slightly preempted myself in that regard, but I'm going to try and say something slightly different here to in print. So this work, I think, essentially it currently, as far as I'm aware, is the most detailed current historical study of a colonial formation of the British Army in Africa. So, I mean, for example, it would relate to previous works on the frontier force, but those are either about the force in quite an administrative sense, such as the Official History by Howard and Clark of 1964, or they are about the individual colony, later national experience of the frontier force, like Okpabi in 1987, which is about the origins of the frontier force, but particularly in Nigeria. And finally, a kind of regional literature. So in Nigeria, probably the best example is Sian Ubar's 1998 monograph about the colonial army in northern Nigeria. So basically, the literature before this work tended to either be kind of institutional or otherwise it worked according to nation/colony or regional sense of organization. And in that way, this work significantly moves forward the historiography of the West African Frontier Force by offering a West Africa-wide narrative that incorporates both institutional history of the force, but also makes full use of the analyses of the war and society type military historical scholarship, so showing the experience of different actors in a kind of wide, socially embedded way that is not limited to that force in a military sense. I think that the very interesting parts of the book are in its kind of first section. So I think it does a very good job of synthesizing a large amount of 19th century material, particularly in these kind of regional chapters, like about the Gold Coast, Nigeria, and then Gambia, Sierra Leone. It introduces to Africanist historians, including myself, a kind of literature about the West India Regiment and the connections between Sierra Leone and the West India Regiment that I don't think is kind of generally covered in the literature elsewhere. And similarly, it's kind of narrative of the formation of British military forces in the Gold Coast and the kind of coast of what is now Ghana, and in the colony of Lagos and early kind of colonial Nigeria, again, is is very sophisticated. There are all kinds of new angles that come out of that, such as the narrative of the use of slavers as recruiters, so African slave procurers as recruiters for coastal forces, which is a fascinating kind of part of the section on the Gold Coast, and the use of individuals for the Force Publique of the Congo to obtain soldiers for the Congo in West African soldier markets, again using techniques likely from slave recruitment. So there's a kind of much wider geographical range in this narrative, going as far as the Congo and the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, that in the 19th century period, I think the one thing that doesn't come out as much is the Sahelian reference to this. Now, that might seem a strange thing to say insofar as the Sahel is not incorporated into colonial territories in this period, but it does form a potential recruitment reservoir, particularly if we're talking about individuals traveling to the northern parts of modern-day Nigeria, modern-day Ghana, to recruit or forcibly recruit soldiers. So there's a question, I think, of what had happened to the ethos of soldiering in the late kind of Sokoto period and in the Sahel of the late 19th century, and whether there were parallel ideas of soldiering that existed there at the same time as British military forces were becoming established on the coast. Part of the kind of the institutional side, I think, of it in the late 19th and early 20th century is also the transfer of cultures from the Indian Army, which feeds into all kinds of areas that are covered in the book, including martial race recruitment and the treatment of religion in the frontier force and language. But I think possibly that there's some kind of chapters that are not, that I think are quite important, but perhaps are not as fully present as they might be, particularly in terms of the personnel and administrative culture of the Indian Army and the way that shaped the frontier force. So, for example, in kind of historiography like Metcalfe's study of kind of the influence of the Raj in British colonial Africa. The later sections of the book also have considerably innovative sections, for example, about uniforms and insignia. It incorporates insights from recent Francophone historiography, for example, on families and the study of women's interactions with colonial military. And also about the role of religion, so for example, of chaplains and imams in the kind of interwar and Second World War frontier force. And this kind of draws on like an early account of that in Killengrave's 2010 book, but I mean that's developed, I think, here. I think, however, in that analysis, one thing that I was kind of left wondering about was the whether these, for example, in the case of Islam, whether the imams were left to basically further the ideology of the frontier force or a belief in the legitimacy of the frontier force by undertaking religious ministry, but effectively that was a straight, relatively homogenous activity, or whether there's a possibility for this material to link into kind of historiography, for example, in Nigeria on colonial Muslim responses to colonial occupation. So, for example, like in Umar Sani's work on northern Nigeria. So whether there's any evidence of the kind of whether it is apologetics or whether there's a kind of discourse that imams use in preaching, for example, or in other sources that works against the military claims or the authority-based claims of the frontier force, whether there's an ambiguity in those power relations. I think probably the main area that I think is missing in the work is surrounding ex-service and demobilization, but particularly ex-servicemen in particularly, I mean, this is most notable in relation to the Second World War, but that's probably because the literature is more accepting of the idea of ex-servicemen as relates to the Second World War, but potentially it could be made to do with the First World War or the 19th century wars or retired soldiers of the 19th century forces. But basically the role of this, so the age-old historiographical controversy of what's the social or political role of ex-servicemen, if there was one, whether more mundanely whether ex-servicemen were brought back in to train, for example, in the build-up of the Federal Army before the Civil War, whether there were ex-servicemen from the 40s or 50s that were brought back in to train soldiers there. So it doesn't have to necessarily be an ideological role, it could be a practical and military role. I think that the point Gloria raised slightly earlier on about stigma around military service is an interesting point that remains a bit ambiguous here in terms of how strong were these perceptions of soldiers as being like slaves. I mean, there's plenty of evidence in the book of soldiers either being slaves or being treated in the same way as slaves, but how tenacious was this link between soldiers and slaves? Were there like positive valuations of military service in West African cultures when these were for colonial forces? A final area that I'd identify, which is a slightly more prosaic, but I think is important, is the question of what could be called combat performance or combat efficiency of African troops in the colonial army. So this actually also has a social history connotation because it suggests questions about morale or about how far soldiers identified with the colonial army itself. And that is how soldiers performed either in the First or Second World Wars or in kind of operations to suppress internal dissent within West Africa, behaviors like rebellion, desertion, and so forth. So I think the kind of account of that is an important question mark that comes out of the book. And I know there's discussion of desertion within the book, but I think a kind of account of the positive and negatives, if you like, of soldiers' actual performance on the battlefield is not entirely clear. But despite those areas that I've kind of flagged up, as I hope that I've made clear at the beginning of this brief presentation, that this work is a major contribution to the historiography of the West African frontier force throughout all of the British West African colonies. It has significant comparative value as well. I mean, it offers an aesthetic narrative that we don't have for the French army in West Africa in the same way in the period described either. So it has a comparative value outside the study of English-speaking British West Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Modi has just joined. Manuel, if you could hear me. Professor Modi, are you there? So I don't know whether he has issues, with his connection. Okay, so okay, he's gone. So I think he probably has a technical questions. Unfortunately, Mufon couldn't join, so we have quite a bit of time. So we're gonna leave you him to respond to the comments from the discussants.
Okay, thank you very much. And the first thing I'd like to do is thank you all for being here and for doing this. It's so wonderful. And I know it's a lot of work and everybody's busy, but I really appreciate it. And of course, when you write a book and it goes out there in the world and you often don't really know who reads it and what happens to it. So it's good. And I really appreciate everybody doing this. And also, I'd like to thank Lagos Studies Association and particularly Sahid Adrento for putting this all together. It's a ton of work, I know, but it's a great event. So, okay, lots of stuff to talk about. I'll just go person by person. So, Fisayo, the issue about widows, really and this is going to be my answer to a lot of these questions. I mean, that needs to be a separate research project of its own. And that's going to be my answer to about 10 of these questions. But one thing, thinking back on the colonial military records, one thing that comes clear to me is the absence of anything about them, really. And I think that says something, that the colonial military didn't care about the widows of soldiers who had died in service. And now there were some provisions for them, gratuity payments and things like that. So they're not completely absent, but from what I remember of the documents, they were, not really thought of, basically, which was very common of how those documents talk about or don't talk about really things about women in the West African Frontier Force and all the different units that were there. And the issue of the mummy markets is really fascinating, and I've come to find out more about that since I wrote the book. I mean, when you look at a 2022 book, you think, well, a lot of students think the author wrote it yesterday, but actually this was written over years, right? And last year, about this time, a little bit later, maybe when I was in Nigeria, I had the pleasure of meeting Chris Ochefu. Now, some of you may have heard of him because it turns out he's the head of this Association of Nigerian Universities. I forget the name now. So he's the son of Maria Ochefu, who founded Mammy Markets as a company. We were together at a workshop. Actually, it was very similar to this because it was a workshop at National Defense College about this book. And he grew up in a military family, so it was very fascinating to have him there and engage with him about this. And I think what I'm left with about the mummy markets, the modern one, is that what Maria Ochefu did was to formalize it, was to make a formal style of business out of it, to actually create a limited liability company. Whereas before, what women associated with the military were doing was just, an informal thing. So, although very important, of course, in supplying logistical services and all kinds of things to the military. So what happened there with the mommy markets of today coming up in the 50s was really a very entrepreneurial person taking the idea and turning it into kind of a modern Western style incorporated business. And of course, you see those mommy markets now everywhere. You could buy anything in them and so on. I guess the martial race thing keeps coming up, and I'll come back to it. Gloria, lots of questions. They're all great. I like how you call it a dense book. I don't know if that's a compliment or not. We'll put that on the back. It's a dense book. So on the cost issue, just a practical thing. I'm acting as the publisher's advertiser here. There's a sale on now for some of these books, 75% off. So if you go on their website, this book, or I think all of them in that series, for 75% off. It's just the sale ends on Sunday. So I'm the guy coming on TV saying, buy my stuff at discount price. Okay. The question about the northern elites, most kind of disillusion with the military and that affecting recruiting from the British primary sources, the officers who were doing the recruiting, they wrote that and say we're not getting recruits from other groups, and sometimes explain exactly why. But Kanuri and Fulani, I think it's because, and I'm kind of speculating, and I should have speculated about this more in the book. Those recruit groups the British are getting to join the army are probably from what they see as more marginal places. Because I think the Muslim northern people who were beginning to see the military as dubious were more urban people in the big centers. And so they're looking more to people from the peripheries who, are more desperate for jobs and money and maybe also into different, syncretic kinds of religions and things like that. And of course, for the middle belt people, this is when they start to really come into the army, particularly in World War II, but it starts in the 30s. And, this is what the British, what the British negatively call the primitive pagans, quote, quote. And I think then, in fact, I think I sort of explained this, that in a way, the army in Nigeria, at least, becomes a factory for making Hausa people because they come into the army as, quote, primitive pagans. They learn Hausa, they convert to Islam, or maybe become more serious about it. And now there's something else, And so the army is creating identities in a way. What was this now? Okay, I knew you were going to ask about the Igbo martial race thing. So, and you're right. I mean, it does in a way come down to one incident of mistaken identity, and some officer just screwing up. But another thing that comes out there, and I think it's very important, there's very practical factors in recruitment. In those days, and we're talking about very early 1900s, the military, comes to southeastern Nigeria as a foreign force. The officers are British, the troops are either Hausa or Yoruba, Hausa in big quotation marks. And they're interested in recruiting local people, there's no doubt. They write about that. They want people from the southeast to join the army because they all want, manpower. They want recruits, and it's not easy to get them sometimes. And, the British do all these experiments and, they test this Igbo group and that one, and they seem to know about the history of those groups. But it comes down often to the simple fact they don't have instructors who speak their language. And I think in those days, things like pidgin was not so common, right, as it is now. So people coming from a more hinterland type of areas, it was difficult for the army to deal with them. They even came to join, but then when they're there, they don't have anyone to teach them or lead them because the older soldiers are not from that area, right? And I think those practical things are more important than anything else. But, the British were obsessed with this idea of martial races, and then they painted that over any other thing and created all kinds of myths and stereotypes about that. The other practical reason, too, is, as you know very well and you've written about, I mean, this is the conquest era for southeastern Nigeria. And the conquest there was horrific. It was terrible. The Southern Nigeria Regiment, as it was then, we're talking 1900, 1905, 1910, even later, they often go from community to community, destroying each one as they go. It's terrible. And that horrific nature of a conquest there, I don't think it's been emphasized enough in the literature. We know a lot about like the big battles in northern Nigeria. There's a couple of really big engagements, and then the Sokoto Caliphate surrenders, and that's it. It's over. It's a big centralized state. A few battles and a key surrender, and the conquest is over. In southeastern Nigeria, because it's so decentralized, the conquest takes years and years, and it's just so horrific. And Hugh Trenchard is in charge of a lot of it, and he goes on to found the Royal Air Force. And I spoke about this at Trenchard Hall in Ibadan one time. So when you're engaged in that kind of horrific type of military conquest operation, I think it's hard to get the people you are victimizing maybe to join your military because of context of violence. Though some obviously do want to join, and those operations don't happen everywhere all the time. And language really, I think language is a key issue, really, practical issues like that. And it becomes an issue from the records I have. I mean, this is an issue everywhere. Because West Africa is so linguistically diverse, and often recruits are coming from, places without a lot of, or Western type missionary schools, or before they were established in those areas. It's difficult for the military to provide leadership and instruction to all different groups. It comes up over and over again. And it throws up all kinds of ambiguities because, for instance, in Ghana, I know we're talking mostly about Nigeria today, but in Ghana, the official command language of the military was Hausa, because essentially the military was transplanted from Nigeria to Ghana. And they initially tried to recruit people from the north and all of that. They initially tried to make it a Hausa thing. But by the 20s and 30s, they've got no recruits who speak Hausa at all. So they have a command language that's adopted from another country, and it doesn't suit the recruits. And they eventually have to change it, and they take up the teaching of English and the use of English. And so by the time English is adopted across the whole regional force structure, the Gold Coast Regiment's far ahead in that, because it had to deal with that issue before. So, just the linguistic practicalities are an issue. Okay, on the issue of women in the military, different questions. The Magajia, that is a term only used in Nigeria and Ghana. In Sierra Leone and the Gambia, they use the term head woman. And I wondered why they don't use it, but I'm not very sure. But it's the same thing, basically. Now, it's very interesting that you're right. These are the only women, and there's not that many of them, who get paid in the military. Yet there's many other women doing things for the military. I mean, the military wouldn't have worked without women cooking and cleaning and providing all the logistical services, because they don't have any logistical services up until World War II, basically, or very minimal. And, the symbolism of the Magaji is important. So, for instance, down in southern Nigeria, the battalions of the Nigeria regiment that were posted in places like Calabar and so on, that the Magaji even wore a special uniform that was slightly different than the other ones. She has a hat and a sash, and there's a military tunic over a kind of dress. That's different. And I think the Magaji institution, it starts before colonization. They pick it up from pre-colonial institutions, and it's there throughout the whole colonial military history of Nigeria and Ghana too. And it's there with the other areas. They don't just call it that. Now, in terms of the Polish officers coming along in World War II, of course, they're there because they're exiled from German-occupied Poland, right? And they somehow make it to Britain. And then the language issue comes up again. These guys, some of them, their English isn't very good. So the British would like to use them, and their use is also important for propaganda, right? Because they're people, displaced by Hitler and struggling to free their home country from abroad. But because they don't have great English, someone makes a decision, well, we might as well send them to Africa because no one's English is very good there. So they won't be as much of an issue. And so they end up there. And I think, why are they more free in relationships with local West African women? I should have gotten into that more a bit, but I guess, and I don't remember this coming up in the sources, but I would guess it's because Poland didn't have colonies in Africa, and they don't have the same colonial baggage maybe as British and French. But at the same time, there's no shortage of racism in Eastern Europe. I don't know if that's a more recent thing or not. But so that's a kind of guess about that. The generational divide issue. Yeah, I mean, I brought that up for the British women because the sources talk about it, right? Especially in terms of the post-World War II years. And I think there's some conflicts happening there between the older and younger generations. I didn't find any real evidence about it for the African wives, women associated with African women associated with the military. But it's a very good question. And, you know, there must have been some. There always is generational conflict everywhere you go, not only among women, but men too. And that's really something, you know, that could be taken up later. Chima, is that a hand up? Am I going on too long?
No, you can, you know, you can.
I thought you were raising your hand to stop.
No, I was trying to get in touch with Modi, who just joined again. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should I continue?
Yeah, you can. You know, we will have.
Well, there he is.
We have about 34 minutes. So if you go on for like maybe the next 5 minutes or so, we leave it up for questions.
Okay, on the channels of communication between wives and husbands, especially in World War II, I think it's just letters. And the soldiers are often complaining in their letters and things about not receiving letters from their wives. So there must be an expectation that they will get some, and when they don't get some, they're angry or upset about it. Beyond that, I don't know. And I think, and of course, the military facilitated that, or wanted or tried to facilitate that communication, but it wasn't always possible, given the number of people, the vast geographic area, literacy issues, and so on. On the issue of other sources, I completely agree with you. I wish I had done extensive oral history and so on, but there's a couple of issues there. One is that I was writing about 4 different countries, and some of them are pretty big. So practically, I think it wasn't possible. And also, I began to think, and I considered this when I was planning the project. Really, there aren't very many veterans of this force left, and the only ones who are alive are a few who were enlisted at the very end of it. And I have to do a kind of cost-benefit analysis of, is it worth spending time and money to find them? What will I get from it? And will I only get things from the 1950s? And I thought, well, it's better to focus just on what I know I can get. Now, in a previous project I did, a previous book on Black security force personnel in colonial Zimbabwe, which was kind of like the precursor of this one, I did that because it was just about Zimbabwe. And as someone who worked in Southern Africa for many years, I could get around Zimbabwe very well. I actually know the local language to a certain extent. I had more of a personal connection with it, and it's more manageable. And also, Zimbabwe got independence in 1980. I was doing this in the first decade of the 2000s, only 20 years later, 25, 30 years later. There are more people around, right? So I was able to talk to World War II veterans and veterans of the 50s, 60s, and 70s from a liberation war period. I didn't think that would be possible considering, that this project ended basically in the 50s, and I was doing this in the sort of late 2010s, more time had passed. But I think other people should get into it, and I really would like to see researchers if someone from like Kebbi State in Nigeria has this special relationship with the military. Someone from there should really get into those communities and get into the oral history of the connection between families there and the Nigerian military, colonial and post-colonial. And you'll get more on post-colonial. So I hope what I did, will maybe just encourage someone to do projects like that, or on other areas too. So, okay, on to Oliver. Oliver, I read your review in Canadian Journal of African Studies, and I really like to thank you. I would really like to thank you for it. And I think there's a few reviews out there of it now, and I think yours was the one that really gets it, gets what I was trying to do. Because it's all about the people who are part of this, right? I mean, there's no military without the soldiers, their wives. We know a lot less about them, but that's what I was trying to bring out in the book. I should have been more explicit about that maybe in the introduction. I tried to be a bit. So thanks for recognizing that about the book in your review. In terms of the questions here about the Sahel and parallel ideas of soldiering, I think it's there a bit in terms of the slave soldier concept, and I do link it into Sarah Westwood's work on that a little bit, but the details are hard to flesh out because the sources are kind of lacking, But it's a great question for future research. The issue of religion and imams, that's also interesting. And it shows you how we're dependent on finding sources and specific articles. I would have never been on religion winning this file out of Ramuna. There's no surprise to find it. I never saw anything like that before at Kew or the other archives in Nigeria or the other countries. A specific file on the appointment and recruitment of the colonial military. And because it's talking about imams and religion, it has information in there you won't find anywhere else on the religious affiliations of soldiers and so on. Unfortunately, in talking about the appointment of imams, it doesn't say much about what they tell people, right? And that's a big question, and someone could do that, I think. And the thing with imams, they're appointed. Okay, they're there early in the history of the late 19th century, but then they're kind of done away with in 1920 or so. But then they come back to World War II. So I think because they were a slightly more recent thing in a way, you might be able to find people who knew them, or maybe even find some who were there at the very end of a colonial period. But I'm not sure exactly what they were telling, the troops that they talked to. And so that's another thing for someone to take up. The issue of ex-servicemen, yeah, I mean it's a well-debated concept, of course. Killing Ray, Adrian Israel, Chima Korea here has written about it in his great book on Nigeria and World War II. I mean, I realized when I was doing the research, I had to say something about this. But at the same time, I realized because of all the debates about it, and because, well, essentially it's something that belongs to the history of the country besides the military. I mean, it's its own topic in a sense, right? I had to kind of define my parameters in a realistic way. And once people left the army, there's only so much I could chase them without doing another topic, and it really needs that question of ex-servicemen and their impact, especially after World War II, much debated, as I said, but it needs its own kind of treatment. And there is a PhD student in West Virginia, Wally, Wally. He's doing that for Nigeria, I think. And not just looking at roots of nationalism, that kind of thing, but other issues like Chima wrote about in terms of bride wealth and so forth. Veterans of World War I, veterans of conquest wars in the 19th century, harder to get into, I think. But it comes out here and there in the book with certain individuals, like the Dan Dowra, who there's a picture of and who I write a bit about. Because he is actually called back into the military. He's there in the conquest era. New Lugard and so on. And he retired after World War One, but is brought back kind of on contract when they set up the recruit depot at Zaria. And he's sort of the first like head instructor, sergeant major. So he's brought back for that. He'd been doing other things before, and then he goes on to do other things later. Combat effectiveness. You know, when I initially thought of this project, there were two kind of two essentially theoretical concepts I was interested in exploring. One was military culture, which I found a lot of information on. And I think that's, you know, well represented in the book. The other one I was thinking of was this issue of combat effectiveness. And, you know, there are these debates about it, right? Why do soldiers fight? And there's this primary groups versus, what's the other one, kind of nationalism and indoctrination, and as you know, Omar Bartov and all of these things. And I thought I could do something like this for British colonial West Africa, but I really found not much in the sources that would tell me anything new about that. Or, and there is an article that talks about that for Burma. Is it? I've forgotten the author now. Is it Barkawi? But it's pretty. The part on the African troops is pretty thin. Do you remember the author?
Kaushik Roy. His comparison.
Kaushik Roy? Maybe. He talks about a number of things there. But I found that article a bit vague, you know, and I didn't feel I could, in the sources I found, I didn't think I could add much more to it, you know. So if somebody can find some sources, that'd be great. But in a way, you know, unfortunately, the time has passed where we can kind of do that, because the Second World War generation is basically gone. And I think that's that their passing represented the last opportunity. It's unfortunate that historians get interested in these things after the generations pass away, you know. So I think it's an open question. I don't really, you know, I can't really answer the question of why Nigerian or Ghanaian troops did what they did in these wars, or how they responded. But I do know, I mean, generally, they were, and I'm talking, you know, outside of debates about why and the reasons and so, they were considered pretty good, effective troops. They did well in the different theaters of the world wars that they were sent to fight. That in the documents, there's some occasional complaints and debates about this or that national group or ethnic group, but there's a reason why the British kept sending them to fight these wars. They did well. They did as well as anybody else. I think that's about it. Yeah. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know. We're going to try to see if we have some questions from the audience, but I think generally this is a you know, fantastic, you know, a book. I think I did enjoy reading it myself. Particularly the, you know, the fact that it paid attention to people, you know, it paid attention to people. And I think I like the fact that, you know, you also emphasize how these soldiers, you know, shaped the military and, you know, colonial institutions, which I think is sort of a great perspective to that. But so let me start with maybe a very simple question. I don't know if I missed this in reading the book. Do you have, you deal with religion, right? Which I think is a very which is a very important part of, you know, the Nigerian society, you know, particularly, you know, the post-40s and stuff. Did you find anything in terms of the relationships between Muslims and Christian soldiers?
Yeah, there's a bit in there, especially when, you know, one of the most fascinating things I was able to find, and it's one of these things you can only imagine sometimes happening, you know, is when African soldiers joined the army, some of them became missionaries themselves in the army. They 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 proselytized. Like the British officers were under pretty strict orders and policies not to proselytize because there was this fear of alienating the Muslim troops. And of course, the British officers were not Muslims. And so there was this fear, and of course, it never really played out, that there would be some kind of rebellion. That never happened. So really, until World War II, there's very little religious proselytizing within the military that we know of. But then during World War II, when you get a lot of Christian recruits coming in, and of course Christianity itself is expanding. Part of it is because of the changing nature of the military. They're recruiting from everywhere. They need lots of people. There's a massive expansion. They need more literate troops who, in this context, have gone to sort of Christian missionary schools. So when those guys get into the army, and especially when they go to Burma, not so much East Africa because it's too early. They're not there yet. It's still a colonial army that goes to East Africa in World War II. But when they go to Burma, it's later in the war, and the whole force is much different. And those privates and corporals go there to Burma with their Bibles in their backpacks, and they start trying to convert people to whatever denomination they're from. And it does seem they converted some of their Muslim comrades to Christianity. And as I mentioned in the book, when those young men get home to a place like northern Nigeria, their decision's not too popular. And they struggle a bit. And I only have on them how difficult their life must have been, and maybe I'm just guessing, or not. I don't know, but I think the issues will come more after service when the troops go home, and there's really very little sense of any conflict between Christians and Muslims or any other groups, religious groups within the military itself. And of course, I think part of it is because the authorities were very conscious of that, and they worked hard to stop that. And as the book gets into, there are a lot of religious kind of accommodations, lots of holidays and festivals recognized, and very generously sometimes. So as far as I know, as far as the sources told me, there really isn't a conflict between Christian and Muslim in the colonial military.
Great. There are a couple of people on participants, about 12. If you have any questions, please, you could raise your hands or use the chat to ask your question or comment. Dr. Modi, we've been trying to connect with you. Can you hear us?
Unmute.
Unmute. You can do it here, right? Can you unmute yourself? Okay, so
yes, I have done so. I've done so.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
missed getting you when we were trying to get you to respond. So we have about 7 minutes, and
It's okay.
Dr. Stapleton has already sort of responded to some of the discussions. So you can have few minutes to give us any insight into the book, since there are no other questions, right?
Thank you very much. It's been so difficult connecting.
Yeah.
I've gone through the work and even made a copy. I have a copy now, so it's a great effort. Yes, and I think that will inspire more studies from diverse perspectives of West African soldiers. I noticed
Yeah. Yeah, that's the Nigeria.
Yeah.
Last year, I organized a panel on
that
the Nigerian Navy, and it was a similar thing.
if you can hear me,
Yeah.
yeah, network issues here, my Nigerian style. So in the process, um, in the body, the main body of the work, chapter 1, we are seeing issue of identity, religion, this and that. Religion to me is not so new. The Maji revolt, the Sudan, and so on. We also religious issues where many thousands died because they believed in their charms and so on. So, but in World War II, the Barak Islam and so on, Stapleton, the professor, didn't seem to take into account what happened in the 19th century and early 20th century. So I thought there should have been a relationship. Besides, the issue of number, how many soldiers, British West African soldiers, they also tended to limit itself to 70,000 plus. I thought that we should be talking in terms of over 200,000 soldiers, 200 something, for instance, from my own studies. I thought that the author is rather conservative in the number, but he has insisted we should limit ourselves to in discussing the participation of West African soldiers. And besides, he talked about flogging and so on. I found that at the beginning of the war in Nigeria, for instance, Nigerians were very enthusiastic about enlisting to fight, but they were ignored. It was not until Britain was seriously in trouble that he decided to allow Nigerians, for instance, to fight because from what I found out, it had to do with racial discrimination, racial superiority. Why do you arm blacks to fight in what was considered the European war? What will be the impact of that after the war on colonialism? I thought those should have been discussed. And then, of course, the issue of moral maintenance. The British tended to use and dump the African soldiers. And those were issues one would have wanted to discuss. Yes, the author, like every historian, yes, has the prerogative of choosing his focus and issues addressed. But I think that in future, there will be need to address such issues.
All right. So because we're running out of time, I'm going to give
yes.
Dr. Stapleton to. Yes.
Finally, then the issue of soldiers and then bridewells. I don't know, because after the war, many Nigerians, for instance, re-enlisted into the army. They were so broke, so poor. So I don't know. I know that some of them had radios and so on, and the women wanted to go close to them for that reason. I don't know whether generally that's that's increasing bridewells. Thank you very much.
All right. So, Dr. Stapleton, you're gonna have a few minutes to respond. There's one question on the chat. I know, Dr. Modi, I have disagreed with you on that particular, argument in the past, but we'll leave Dr. Stapleton to respond, please.
Thank you.
Thanks. On the issue of sort of what I wrote in the book is basically reflecting what I found in the research and the sources. And there's a lot of things there, but in organizing the themes, you sort of focus on the points where you have a lot of information. So there may be some points that are not addressed there because I didn't find much on it. That's the nature of research, and maybe in the future people will find new sources that I didn't locate, or that will come up later. On the point of about numbers, the numbers of troops changed constantly based on the period. So it's hard to say there were X number of troops in the West Africa Frontier Force for the whole time. But generally, in peacetime, especially the interwar years, it's, about 7,000 total. But then in World War II, it just mushroomed. It's hard to even get an accurate figure because it's many, many times that. And of course, it's different at different points in the war. On racism and arming Black people and so on, I mean, there were debates about this amongst colonial authorities, and the British and French had very different opinions about it. As you know, I mean, the French were all in having a big African colonial army that they would use to defend the motherland in Europe, right? So the Tirailleurs Senegalais is a huge force, and it's because it was so big, it generated a lot of evidence for historians, and it's very well studied. There's so many historians who've looked at it, from Myron Eckenberg to Sarah Zimmerman and Jackie Woodfork and many, many, many others. Of course, within the Tirailleurs Senegalais, there's still a lot of racism. And it reflects those ambiguities of French assimilationism that was mostly talk and not much action. The British had more of a conservative view about employing African troops in war. They didn't think, for instance, they should be employed against other European troops in Europe or somewhere and they had different views about this. David Killingray wrote an article about this some years back that there were proposals to kind of copy what the French were doing, to have a really big African army to use, especially when there were problems with India, because they had a big army in India. But those proposals never really went anywhere because of cost issues, because of racial stereotypes that Africans couldn't do well in a modern, quote, industrial war, which of course they could because the Tirailleurs had done so. But they did. I mean, they did ultimately arm and train and deploy African soldiers in all sorts of military operations, right from the beginning of the wars of colonial conquest, right in the World War I, World War II. And there's always this sort of, as these world wars unfold, usually with the British policy on deploying African troops, they start by saying, no, we're not going to use them very much. It'll just be in Africa. But then as the war carries on, as they have manpower problems, as the situation becomes desperate, they break those rules and they start sending them places. So in World War I, for instance, just at the end of the war, there was a Nigerian brigade ready to deploy to the Middle East. But it never happened because the war ended suddenly in November 1918. Had the war continued for a while, there would have been Nigerian troops fighting in Palestine and Syria and so forth. Similar with World War II. It starts with their deployment in East Africa, and that's very typical of the history. African colonial units usually fought in Africa. But then the whole Burma deployment, which really becomes the big story of British African troops in World War II, that is sudden, and that is a new thing. That's a departure for sure, and the scale of it is a departure too. And I think it's partly it's because it's suggested by certain officials. Gifford, for instance, because he has his connections, it's appointed to India from West Africa, or from Africa generally. And partly because they need people. And you know, this I used to work on Southern Africa history, and those ambiguities are even more stark in there because of settler colonialism, right? Um, Generally, the white minority regimes in South Africa and Rhodesia did not want to arm Black people at all, right? In Nigeria, Ghana, and so on, they have to because, I mean, there are just not enough British people there. There's hardly any. Uh, but in Southern Africa, because you have these local white settler minorities who have local interests, and there's more of them, they want to dominate the coercive arm of the state. They want to, and they think they can, but they never can because they're a minority. And whenever they get involved in world wars, especially, or their own counterinsurgency struggles later, they always end up, well, they always start by saying, we're not going to arm Black people. Black people should just produce for the war effort and be happy and so forth. But by shortly thereafter, when trouble starts, it's, yep, we're going to arm Black people and they're going to go fight the war, and there's going to be a lot of them. But then usually when they get home from a war, they're disarmed right away. The official position is, oh, let's forget they ever did that. You know, and there's also in those states this sort of philosophical link between military service and citizenship rights. So if you go and risk your life or die for your country, maybe you should have the right to vote. That issue isn't there so much for West Africa because the type of colonialism is different, right? Um, so yeah, there are lots of ambiguities about these things. In a way, that's the reason I wanted to write this book, because when I was doing the similar one on Zimbabwe, it was within that settler colonialism context. And there are periods when the white Rhodesian government did not want to arm any Black people at all. They didn't even have Black people in the military for many, many years, not even in a service support role. But eventually they changed that because they're challenged. And so I wanted to look at another example of an African colonial military, but not in a settler ethos, which is really what got me thinking about this particular project. So thanks for your points.
We have a question on the chat. So we have 3 minutes left, and so I'm going to read it to you if you're not able to say it. The question is, are there parallels that can be drawn from the experiences of the West African soldiers compared with East African soldiers, or variations depending on which side of the war they were fighting on? That's probably the last question. Yeah.
From an anonymous attendee. So there are parallels, and of course, for a while, the King's African Rifles, which is the equivalent British colonial military in East Africa, and the West African Frontier Force, they're actually under the same administrative structure. In the interwar period, they have the same Inspector General. So there's some common overview there, yet they do have different cultures, I think. And one thing I found, that chapter on flogging mentions this. In East Africa, because of the quasi-settler ethos that's there, of course, there aren't really many settlers in East Africa, but there are some. The use of corporal punishment in the military lasts a lot longer and is a lot more, let's say, enthusiastic. In West Africa, there's a lot of differences, territory by territory, going from northern Nigeria, where flogging is happening all the time, to Gambia, where it doesn't seem to exist at all. But then eventually there's a kind of uniform policy that generally it's not going to happen and becomes very, very rare. And so, as I mentioned, I think here in the book, when the West African troops go over to East Africa to fight in World War II, they're a bit surprised to see African troops being actually flogged. And this is like 1940, 41, because that generally was not really happening back home at that time. So even within the British military elements in these regions, there are some slight differences. But there's a lot of similarities to the racial hierarchy and service conditions. And, I think if you were to travel back in time and look at a company from a King's African Rifles from Uganda and another one from a Nigeria regiment, you see them doing their work and on parade and training and maintaining their gear, you'd say, yeah, there's a lot of similarities here. Uniforms and standard operating procedures and things. Now, of course, you can get into other colonial forces and compare them to, say, the German one, German East Africa. Michel Moyd has written about that. The Italian one in Italian East Africa, very little written about that. That would be a very interesting project. But all of them do have some commonalities.
Great. I just want to use the opportunity again to thank every member of the panelists and Dr. Stapleton for presenting and giving us a sort of a wonderful book and some perspective on, the African aspects of colonialism and colonial military, which I think is important and adds to the historiography of Africa, colonialism, British West Africa, and the experiences of Africans as individuals and as soldiers, and the biography of some of these individuals, which sort of makes the book much more interesting. Thank you very much, everyone. We are 1 minute
and thank
over,
you.
but it's a great opportunity to see everyone again. Thank you very much, and
Thank you.
bless you. Right.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to see everyone.
Yeah.